Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with the obvious. Microsoft has finally announced that removing a USB without ejecting it is safe. If you continue to use Windows XP or Windows 7, you are likely to still find a reminder every time you take a USB out of your computer that removing it without ejecting it is unsafe. This admonishment is an archaic tool of the past, in which writing data to a drive may not be completed until certain steps are taken. In recent years, most programs and protocols have done away with it. While not true in all cases, as a general rule, you'll find that removing a USB without ejecting it is generally safe, but best done. As of version 1809 of Windows 10, you can now do as you please and remove it whenever you want. In other, more light-hearted news, Facebook has accidentally left rather subversive messages on tens of thousands of their virtual reality controllers. Facebook has admitted that it accidentally hid bizarre and inappropriate messages inside tens of thousands of virtual reality controllers. This included terms such as Big Brother is watching and the Masons were here, phrases reminiscent of totalitarian governments and invasive companies, something Facebook is working very hard to avoid being branded as. The official story goes that these phrases, terms, and statements were only ever included for prototypes, but an inadvertent communication led to them being included with production models. Facebook does not appear to believe this is adequate means for a recall, but has described them as Easter egg labels meant for prototypes, which accidentally made it onto the internal hardware for tens of thousands of touch controllers. The Facebook representative made the unfortunate response to this by stating that they were telling everyone about it because, to quote, "We think it's important to be transparent with our community and take responsibility when there's an error." End quote. Of Facebook's recent errors, this is perhaps the least egregious, but certainly the most entertaining. In a similar entertaining twist of fate, a soccer fan attempted to get themselves a QR tattoo. QR codes are used as a shorthand link which can be scanned and automatically activate a link to the web page in question. These links are not always as solid as you might think. For example, YouTube will often recycle theirs after several hours. In this case, it gets even better. The fans' team won their match, and the video gave highlights of their triumph. Unfortunately, the rival team's fans reported said video as copyright infringement, and as a result, it was removed, something YouTube readily does as a protection method. This disastrous tattoo is not so far removed from that common many other millennials who tattoo themselves with profound phrases or generic symbols. In the near future, this high-tech tribute to his favorite team may function again, but for now, it's simply an obscure piece of skin art. In another rather awkward and confusing case, an 89-year-old Dutch physician secretly fathered 49 children who were meant to be the product of IVF. As of last week, a DNA test confirmed 49 adults are his children, or is that his illegitimate children? There is suspicion that there may be up to 200 others in total, and that he himself has boasted of having at least 60 kids. As strange as it may sound, This is not necessarily an unusual situation. IVF clinics have very little in the way of supervision. They have certain legal requirements in their operation. Their day-to-day function and their conduct are not necessarily under that much oversight, especially since the number of facilities providing these services has grown in leaps and bounds in the last 2 decades. In another similarly ended story, a Florida man was killed by his cassowary. The cassowary is a large bird similar to an ostrich. It has razor-sharp talons on its feet and an aggressive pattern of behavior in which it will headbutt people. Because of its territorial nature, it is sometimes given the title of the world's most dangerous bird. This should not be all that surprising, given their native ranges include Australia and New Guinea. In this case, authorities are still exploring how the man came to die. The birds in question were kept in a private wildlife park, which explains how he came to have them, but not necessarily why this happened. It likely owes to the aggressive and territorial nature of them. Cassowaries will chase you down and attack you if they feel aggravated or endangered. Next are the miraculously well-preserved Egyptian tombs, with painted walls that look as though they were just completed. One of the tombs dates back over 2,000 years to the Ptolemaic era and belonged to a senior official named Tutu and his wife. Although only 2 rooms in size, the archaeologists found elaborately painted walls and 2 limestone sarcophagi. Tombs that are this well preserved and contain this much material are very rare, following 2 major events. The first being a massive increase in interest during the 20th century, in which tomb robbers would find, excavate, and then sell whatever they could, and actions in the 19th century, in which mummies were believed to provide medicinal value, and so the tombs were raided, the goods destroyed for whatever material that could be salvaged, such as gold and precious stones. The sarcophagi were ravished, and the mummies were taken away to be disseminated as medicine. Although the first tomb is amazing, the second is more so, as it dates back more than 4,000 years to the time of Pharaoh Ejecting. The content and exploration of these tombs has been recorded and uploaded to YouTube in the hopes that it might bolster Egypt's flailing tourism industry, which over the last few years has decreased dramatically. Technology that has been used in tombs is now being helped to rebuild Notredam after its recent catastrophe. A 3D laser scan developed in 2015 could help to rebuild the cathedral after its horrifying disaster on Monday night. The fire caused the roof to fall in and has toppled its iconic central spire. Vassar College's art historian Andrew Tallon made a digital archive in 2015 of the building's unique 13th century construction. He did so using laser imaging. This is technology that has been used in Egyptian tombs to create 3D visual representations for museums. Until relatively recently, the only way to get a measure of an old building was to literally measure it, meticulously and taking every possible precaution. This was a time-consuming and expensive process. The method used here is comparatively cheap. It still provides a degree of refinement that you would get from using a physical measurement. With any luck, this will help to mitigate the fire that destroyed Notredam in an hour, the cathedral that stood 2 world wars and 850 years. We return to an article from last week's What Were They Thinking? The Beresheet probe that crashed into the moon after its primary engine failed hasn't come to nothing. They have decided they are going to send another lunar lander. The billionaire Morris Khan, who already put $43 million into the first lander, has decided they're going to use Beresheet 1 as a building block for Beresheet 2. This kind of optimism is admirable, if not expensive. Going from the admirable, we now head into the world of the stupid. Measles is now considered a global health crisis, with a 300% increase worldwide. The word crisis is used often, and often inappropriately, but in this case, reviewing the data, it appears appropriate, a sentiment shared by both the World Health Organization and UNICEF. While parts of America may be seeing an approximately 200% increase at present, other parts of the world, like Africa, have seen a 700% increase from the year before. Unfortunately, the World Health Organization has very clearly stated that rather than an issue of efficacy on the part of vaccines, it is hesitancy to take the vaccine, something they've called medical hesitancy. And this fear of vaccines is one of the most dire threats to human health. Building on this and returning to last week, the number of incidents in New York City has increased yet again, with 90 diagnoses in the last week alone. For the third week, health officials are adding to the tally of confirmed measles cases. This brings it to 555, the highest number in 5 years, vindicating claims made last week that 2019 is likely to be the worst in at least the last decade. In 2019, there are 555 cases. The highest year in recent history was 2014, with 667 cases for the whole year. Part of New York City, Brooklyn, has virtually all of the cases, with 329. Of those, 273 are current to this year. It's likely that New York City will get far worse before it gets better. In a slight twist of irony, as measles is racking America and many other countries, a 97% effective Ebola vaccine is currently curtailing the outbreak in Africa. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has its second largest Ebola outbreak on record. It has infected just over 1,200 people and killed just over 800. The reason it's not worse is that an experimental vaccine has been deployed. It has a 97.5% effective rate. Despite being experimental, it has been provided to over 90,000 people. This includes 30,000 healthcare and frontline workers. It works in a similar manner to the flu vaccine by making the immune system aware of what biomarkers are relevant to the disease and allowing it to respond sooner and better. Within the DRC, the Ebola outbreak is being contained, but the areas that it is contained within abut other countries, and there is a risk of it spreading to them. Despite that, the World Health Organization has chosen not to declare this a global health emergency. After experts met in Geneva on Friday, since the Ebola outbreak started, the company behind this new experimental vaccine has shipped almost 145,000 doses, and another 100,000 to go in the next few months. Given that it's experimental, such small volume is not surprising. Then again, it is experimental, which makes these numbers very large and very impressive given the nature of the situation. Going from experiments with a practical application such as a clinical trial, we now move on to the more bizarre and unusual. Scientists have restored some cellular function in dead brains. Generally speaking, once a brain is dead, an organism is dead, and it will remain so. You can briefly resuscitate it, but keeping it alive again is generally considered impossible. With the new system, neuroscientists have restored some of the function to the brains of pigs that have been dead for 4 hours. There has been discussion of transmitting the human psyche into a hard drive and allowing it to live on forever after its biological function has been destroyed. This belief has been held as far back as 1818 with Mary Shelley's science fiction novel. But now we are looking at a viable option to begin the process of examining a dead brain as though it were alive, if only in the short term. The method uses 3 stages. The first is a synthetic solution designed to be pumped through the brain. It performs a similar function to cerebrospinal fluid and maintains the brain at around 37 degrees Celsius. The second is a perfusion device which pumps the solution and mimics the supporting organs. The final element is actually a surgical technique that allows the brain to be isolated, effectively a brain in a jar. The researchers obtained their brains from a food processing facility, which meant that no animals were killed specifically for the project. They received the brain 4 hours after death. This modeled the effects of prolonged brain injury. They were then processed for 6 hours. At this point, the researchers were able to observe a clear difference between the brains they had been treating and their control group. Their intervention preserved structure and reduced the number of cells that died. In fact, some molecular and cellular function was restored, including glial and vascular response. Essentially, those that are spinal or non-cognitive responses were restored 10 hours post-death. In fact, indication of such things would have led to their experiment failing, as they did not have approval to conduct anything on a living organism. If they had found any sign of cognition or organized global activity, they would have had to have terminated the experiment, anesthetized the brain, and then somehow euthanized it. The interesting problem with this is one of ethics. There is very little oversight or regulation when it comes to necromancy, or more appropriately, working with dead tissue. If you somehow revive or resurrect it, the way the rules play out isn't very clear at present. In other rather bewildering news, and going into Australia yet again, doctors have identified an anomalous genetic syndrome that is sending a family blind. This is a very rare condition that gradually caused blindness in a handful of families around the world. And now they're trying to understand not just the why, but how to treat it. The condition is called Rosa syndrome, named after the acronym. The different letters stand for each of the organs or tissues damaged, the first being retinopathy, the second being the optic nerve, the third splenomegaly, the fourth anhidrosis, and the fifth is migraines. Researchers believe the blindness is caused by a gene involved in the inflammation pathway. Unfortunately, it's unlikely patients will see a solution any time in the near future, which does not bode well for those families currently diagnosed with it. In more upbeat and pleasant news, a new gene therapy has cured babies with the rare and dangerous condition known as bubble boy disease. 10 newborns with the rare disorder were cured with gene therapy, researchers have claimed. The condition is one of the immune system, and supposedly their treatment has had no side effects or complications, unlike the HIV CRISPR babies. The reason this is so hard to cure is that the children with the bubble boy disease effectively have no immune system, which means they must continuously be isolated from the outside world, lest they get an infection or some other contaminant and die. The work is a bittersweet reward for the researchers involved, as the team leader and senior author on the paper, Brian Sorrentino, spent the final months of his life working to get it functioning and results on the ground, as he died of a fatal cancer. He died as they were able to prove that what they were doing was effective and safe. This is important, as many as 1 in 50,000 infants are diagnosed with this disorder every year. China has managed to get itself back in the news yet again with more ethically fraught experiments. This time, they are breeding monkeys that have added human brain genes. Chinese researchers are attempting to learn more about the way the human brain develops. What they did was add a human brain gene to the genome of the rhesus monkey. This genome is called MCHP1, or microcephalin, and is involved in regulating the fetal growth of the brain. To summarize their findings, the brains developed slower, more in line with how long a human brain takes to grow. They exhibited better memory skills and faster reaction times. The idea of making a monkey that is both smarter, faster, and better should be terrifying to anyone who has watched Planet of the Apes. But the problem here are the ethical implications. The problem with it is that it poses an unacceptable burden of risk to the animals. Not just are they going to die, but they're going to die in an unnecessary and unpleasant way, by comparison to what most research is structured to do. Several researchers involved in the paper are already asking to have their name removed, following the discovery of what was actually being done in detail. In slightly less shocking news, Harvard scientists say Earth was struck by an interstellar object 5 years ago. In 2017, astronomers discovered the first known interstellar object. It was a mysterious cigar-shaped object that gained infamy for people claiming it was sent by aliens. Perhaps why these interstellar objects have received less attention is that rather than passing by and beyond Earth, they instead entered the atmosphere and burnt up. The researchers could identify this by examining data from NASA's Center for NEO Studies, CNEOS. They found an unusual outlier in this data set, a 2014 fireball that hit Earth at a velocity of 60 kilometers per second. This is important because if it had the mass of a Muamua, a cigar-shaped interstellar object, we would have known about it for a brief period of time before the sun is blacked out and we all likely died. Instead, it was small. Small enough that by contrast it made barely a blip on the radar. The researchers were able to backtrack its trajectory and based on its speed, figure out that it likely was not from our solar system. In fact, they think it could have been from the interior of a planetary system or a star in the thick disk of the Milky Way. It is not the only controversial subject regarding astrology at the minute. A controversial paper suggests that an old meteorite could contain active microbial life from Mars. This is not like the mushrooms on Mars, but actual science. In 1996, there was controversy about a meteorite that could have come from Mars, and that controversy continues to this day. However, researchers from Hungary are now claiming to have found a second example. This is a meteorite discovered in the late 70s in the same region of Antarctica. It appears to contain elements that are reminiscent of iron-oxidizing bacteria. These include spherical and thread-like structures. These could be mineralized microbes and their alteration of rock. The authors have submitted a peer-reviewed paper and described these features as fitting well on the 5 hierarchical levels. Unfortunately, what they've found is almost impossible to prove one way or the other, given the limited sample size and the nature of what they've found. It could be a purely statistical and significant finding that unfortunately has confounded everything, or it could be an example of exactly what they think it is, but cannot prove. On a more definitive note, the Lyrid meteor shower is about to start, and there is a nice and very convenient table of how to watch it. As Earth circles the Sun, it passes through the tail of comet C/1861 G1, otherwise known as Thatcher, and as a consequence, us Earthbound organisms are treated to a spectacular light show of meteors burning up in the atmosphere. This is otherwise known as the Lyrid meteor shower, and it occurs more or less in every April of every year. The show will peak just before dawn on the 23rd of April. Those in the northern hemisphere should look towards Lyra, and those in the southern hemisphere, Lyra is going to be unfortunately close to the horizon. This will coincide with a waning gibbous moon. This may make seeing the meteorites somewhat difficult. Following from last week's photographs of the black hole for the very first time, M87 has been given an unofficial name, it being Poehi, which means embellished dark source of unending creation. Officially, the black hole remains M87 asterisk, the asterisk indicating the black hole. For now, the general name used is likely to be one, the other, or both, at least until the International Astronomical Union decides what they will call it. If that was not confusing enough, M87 has now had a recent video made that attempts to give an understanding of its scale. XKCD attempted this with their cartoon showing that, even accounting for Pluto's orbit, our solar system is not even as wide as the black hole itself, let alone its gravitational pull. The video gives a comparison of its size and understanding of what it is you are actually looking at. Somewhat related news. Researchers have demonstrated a nuclear fusion device small enough to keep at home. In this case, it's not a bomb. It's instead a plasma confinement device. Fusion requires clouds of charged particles. The excitation of these produce the power, or more exactly the hot gas. The hot gas then provides heat, which becomes power. This can be done one of two ways. Either the plasma can be swelled and create its own magnetic field that keeps it stable, or alternatively you can apply external magnetic force. The latter option is unfortunately slightly more difficult, as it has a number of issues. The first and simplest of which is the magnets get very hot, and as a consequence cease being magnetic. This newest device takes these approaches and shrinks them down. The plasma that would either be contained by magnets or swirled around to create its own magnetic force is instead put through a small magnetic area as a jet of plasma. This forces the plasma particles together due to the bottleneck of a magnetic ring. This is called the Lorentz force. The researchers in this case created a 50 centimeter long column of plasma using this method. It only went for 5 microseconds. In that time it generated compelling evidence, particularly that its stability was 5,000 times stronger than you'd find without such a method being used. In theory, the principle behind it should be useful in the future, but that is considered away in the future. Another study this week looked at how scientists could prevent water from forming into ice. Given the way of global warming, this seems rather counterintuitive. When you're examining things like road safety, it could be useful. Freezing water at 0 degrees centigrade is simply accepted as a universal constant. Scientists in Sweden last year were proving this wrong, where they're able to make water remain liquid at -45 degrees centigrade. Researchers this year have smashed that record by going all the way down to -263 degrees centigrade, just slightly above absolute zero, where in theory all things stop moving. They did so by the addition of a secondary chemical. This is much like antifreeze in your radiator. The Swiss researchers used a lipid mesophase, which allowed it to form a semi-solid, but still remain a liquid. Think of this as adding salt to water. It creates salt water, but the water remains water. Their method prevents the formation of crystals. Without crystals, there is no ice. As strange as the next topic may sound, physicists have managed to measure precisely nothing. While this may sound like a jab at physicists, it's actually a difficulty in what they do. Many things can add into the background sound and complications of anything in a physics equation or experiment. Tiny sound waves can actually look like large echoes in a delicate experiment. More Swiss researchers have used lasers to understand the quantum nature of a vacuum where there should be no sound, or, for that matter, anything. If you have ever sat in a quiet room, you will find that you begin to pick up on sounds you would not notice otherwise. This could be creaking, dripping, or even your own heartbeat. This is a perfect example of what you presume to be a vacuum, but is not. The physics researchers were finding the same problem. Their vacuum experiment should in theory provide a perfect baseline. What they are trying to understand are the quantum fluctuations. The researchers did this by taking two laser pulses that are a trillionth of a second in length, sent through super cold crystals at different times and in different locations. They then examined how the crystal's atoms affected the light. Even doing this as they did, they had trouble evaluating the results. In fact, even detecting the signal was something they had incredible difficulty with. They had to get 1 trillion observations just to allow for the statistical variation. If you were to try and do your own experiment, in theory, you could use as few as 3 data points. This allows you to create an average and to remove an outlier in an emergency. In practice, it should be closer to 30. The reason they needed 1 trillion observations is that each measurement was so tiny, in fact minuscule, that they couldn't be sure if the results happened to be measurements or that background radiation, even within their vacuum. Going from the hard science to something a little more humorous. Hayfever is kicking up again in the Northern Hemisphere, and there's a rumor going around that sex could be a cure for it. The original cause of this was a 2009 article. Unfortunately, if it had been followed, the recent evidence that there is less sex in the United States of America would not have held true. The original article was published in Medical Hypotheses, a somewhat real journal that hosts hypotheses where experimental support is yet fragmentary, to give novel, radical new ideas and speculation in medicine open-minded consideration, which sounds a whole lot like, we can't afford to sell pseudoscience and woo, but we're gonna try. The article argued that since decongestants work by constricting nasal blood vessels, male ejaculation or masturbation may also do the same. They both rely on the same sympathetic nervous system to constrict blood vessels. The article was very quickly counteracted by another that was published in the same journal. However, the initial story received a great deal of media attention, and given that this year has been particularly bad for hay fever, any solution will be examined by those in desperate need. Next, we have the Swiss again. Switzerland's government has decided that coffee is not going to remain on its essential products for a world war. Switzerland has long since been stockpiling products in case of World War III. This is a byproduct of what happened in World War II. Every year it goes through a reassessment of what it considers vital goods to stockpile for emergencies. Their government has examined this and come out with the following quote: "The National Economic Supply has checked the maintenance of today's compulsory storage of coffee. Coffee is not vital according to the criteria that apply today. That is, coffee contains almost no calories and therefore does not make any contribution to food security from a nutritional point of view." As of now, Switzerland holds some 15,300 tons of green unroasted coffee beans. In theory, it's about 3 months of coffee supply. While the government holds that there's no caloric benefit, others are arguing that coffee contains uses that have not been considered, including antioxidants and vitamins. Fortunately, the Swiss population has 3 years to find a solution to this, as the draft regulation will not take effect until the end of 2022. And the final story today is about a bizarre worm that has no mouth or gut, but still manages to survive. The flatworm called Paracatanula has its shortcomings, but being friendly with its symbiotic bacteria is not one of them. The strange worm lives with bacteria that occupy specialized organs within it. These organs are called trophosomes, and they fill up the main body cavity of the worms. The bacteria are chemosynthetic, which means they use a chemical process to produce energy rather than photosynthesis. The bacteria use these to create a variety of foods, particularly lipids and proteins, that the worm then feeds on. The bacteria excrete these products in tiny pearls that the worm then consumes without harming the bacteria. Normally in this sort of relationship, the worm would consume the bacteria to get to its gooey inner goodness. It's a truly equitable form of symbiosis. And more details on this bizarre worm can be found in the links below. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.